Hi, good morning, and please join me in welcoming Professor Joel Lee to the latest of the Karmayogi Talks. Joel Lee co-pioneered the teaching of negotiation and mediation in the Singapore universities and has played a significant role in furthering the development of mediation in Singapore, not just in education, but also in practice. A graduate of Victoria University of Wellington and Harvard Law Schools, Joel is an associate partner with CMT Partners in the US and a principal mediator and the training director of the Singapore Mediation Center. He's also an adjudicator in the Financial Industries Dispute Resolution Center and was a member of the International Mediation Institute's Independent Standards Commission and Intercultural Task Force. He's also a key member of the Ministry of Law's Working Group on International Commercial Mediation. He's presently the founding chair of the board of the Singapore International Mediation Institute. Joel, I have to ask you, is there any mediation institute in the world that you're not a part of?
I'm sure there are many. I'm sure there are many, and I try to contribute where I can and be connected where I can. But like you and I have limited resources and capacity, so we do our best.
And I just want to end by saying in 2011, Joel was awarded the Outstanding Educator Award, which is the National University of Singapore's highest teaching award. As you all know, we have close relationships with the National University of Singapore, and so it's a great pleasure to have someone as prominent as Professor Joel Lee to join us on this Karmayogi talk. Professor Lee, you talk a lot about bridging the trust deficit, and we've entitled this Karmayogi talk, Bridging the Trust Deficit, Conflict Resolution as a Governance Tool. So can you start off by telling us a little bit about what is a trust deficit? And what are the
Sure.
causes of some of the trust deficit between the government, its citizens, and its stakeholders?
Okay. So, firstly, Adil, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here at this talk. Um, Sometimes when I'm introduced the way that you have just introduced to me, I look around and try to figure out who you're talking about because sometimes I don't feel that that's me at all. But my background and my specialization comes from really the field of negotiation, mediation, consensus building, conflict resolution. So to be entirely upfront, I am not a governance expert. I'm not obviously a public policy expert. But I think some of the things that I have a background in, I can probably bring to bear to our conversation. So turning to then the question of the trust deficit. Actually, that was really one of the questions that I was intending to pose to you, because actually why there's a trust deficit in any jurisdiction will really depend on the context, right? So before we even look at the notion of trust deficit, I think it might be firstly useful to consider sort of like a particular model for analyzing these problems. This model comes from a field called neuro-linguistic programming. It was created by one of the original co-developers, Robert Dilts, and it's called the SCORE model, SCORE, the SCORE model. And essentially the SCORE model it's an acronym that stands for a number of different things, but once you put those things together, it helps us actually think about and analyze the situation. So the S stands for symptoms. So what are the symptoms that we are facing of a problem that we're trying to resolve? C is causes, using an analytical tool to think about what the causes of those symptoms may be. Then switching our mind to then outcomes, which is O. What are we trying to achieve? In other words, what's the opposite of trust deficit, right? Because I think for a lot of us, when we say, well, we have a problem with trust deficit, while it's easy to say, well, we want trust, it's not entirely sure what that looks like and how that gets translated into actual things on the ground, right? It's nice as a concept, but we need to know just a little bit more. So the R stands for resources. What resources can we bring to bear? And then finally, what are the effects and the long-term benefits that we're looking at? So each of these stages that's denoted by SCORE helps us think through and takes us through to a solution-oriented approach. Now, I apologize, I've spent a bit of time sharing that idea, but it's actually a very useful idea when we're trying to problem solve, right? So then if we then apply this notion that we say, okay, what are the symptoms of the trust deficit that we have been talking about? I think if we take a look at observable symptoms of observable signs of a trust deficit, actually we're seeing a few things, right? Number one is public distrust of public institutions, right? So put a certain way, public institutions can say what they want to say, do what they want to do, but there's always a certain level of cynicism at the ground level. At the ground level, people are saying, you can say all you like, it's never going to amount to anything, right? And it leads to cynicism, it leads and of course, this is one of the problems of distrust. The second, in terms of the trust deficit, is what we will refer to, I think, as low policy compliance. It's linked to the first point, right? If we want people to jump on board to a certain sort of thing, but the populace isn't actually going to comply with it quite as much, right? Then we're going, well, so what if I comply? So what if I don't comply, right? I don't have enough trust in the system to actually say that it makes sense for me to comply. I'm motivated to comply, or I will be so penalized if I don't comply, right? And that's not always easy to do, right? The third type of, I think, trust deficit would be bureaucratic inefficiencies. Now, I realize that inefficiencies are existing in every organization, right? But there are efficiencies that are understandable, and sometimes efficiencies that just are created as a result of many things layering over the years, right? Some of them are legacy problems. Some of them are just, you just kind of need to prune the garden a little bit type problems. And it's not easily solvable because sometimes it's just easy to let the garden stay the way it is, as opposed to just working with doing some actions for it. And then finally, there might actually be a business government disconnect, that the goals of what the government is trying to do does not actually match what the businesses want, right? And I realize that government and governance requires to have much bigger picture. However, one of the challenges is how do we then get the populace and the businesses in a consensus building process to move us towards the same goal, right? So I don't want to sort of hold forth. I really don't like lecturing, but I just want to sort of provide that score model and then share with you at least some initial thoughts about sort of like the symptoms of the trust deficit.
Sure. No, I think that's very helpful. And in fact, I was going to ask you to talk about the symptoms, but also what are some of the institutions that you see that always typically score, not score, but that have low, that have a high trust deficit, right? That people don't trust. Is it like people don't trust the income tax department, right? Or they don't trust the police, or they don't trust the securities, people who look after securities? What are typically some of the institutions where you've seen that there is a big trust deficit?
Yeah, it's hard to say because it really is contextual, right? So I would say that, for example, the police, drawing from an example that I'm familiar with, in Singapore, we have a very high trust level with the security forces, with the police, correct? In the US, even before its current sort of challenges that it's facing, there was always a little bit of I'm not so sure if I trust the police, and especially if, for example, you were colored, right? In New Zealand, which I know a little bit about because I lived there for about five and a half years, they also have sort of this inherent distrust of the police, sort of seen as sort of like the henchmen of the state, as it were. So I think it really does depend.
I see. Okay.
I'm not in a position, for example, to say that in India, whether
No, that's fine. I was
practice or
just
not.
trying to get some
Yeah,
I was just
yeah,
trying to get some examples.
right,
Don't worry about making it contextual to India. We
correct,
understand,
correct.
right? But in many countries, people don't. There's always a trust deficit with the people who take your money, like the tax people.
Yes, that is true. If I can share with you a very funny anecdote, I have a foreign colleague who comes from Canada, and one day we were having lunch. This was many years ago, and he said to me, "Joel, I've just filled in my income tax." And I braced myself, Adil, I tell you, I braced myself. Why? Because I was ready to be criticized for how much money we were taking and all of that. And I faced a very pleasant surprise. He looked at me and says, I have never been so happy to pay taxes. And I went, what? You know, and I looked at him and I said, could you say more? And he says, listen, I have lived in many different countries, and those countries have taken a large proportion of my taxes, and I've never been able to see the impact of those taxes. I don't actually know what they go to do and benefit. In Singapore, when we pay those taxes, it's very clear because it's transparent. We know that it goes to these things, and the roads work, and the infrastructure is good, and trains run on time. I mean, occasionally we have problems, and that's true of every country, which is why I don't understand my countrymen. The train breaks down and we complain. I mean, if you lived overseas and your train breaks down are normal, and you just have to accept that as part and parcel of life. But we're spoiled, right? Singaporeans are spoiled, but that's because our government runs things so well in that context. Now, going back then to how might we say that an institution has a high trust deficit or low deficit or high trust level? I think part of it is how transparent things are, right? Usually, a lot of government is done in this black box, right? Things happen, an outcome occurs, and it's not entirely clear what the deliberations have been, whether there has been consultation, consensus, and so on and so forth. So the opacity of it, the lack of transparency makes people doubt. Now, it's not to say that there needs to be absolute transparency, okay? But I think that it would help if institutions signpost the things they're doing, give people the insight as to the processes by which they would engage in to make this particular decision. Now, it may be that governments already do that, sometimes to good effect, sometimes not to good effect, but that's usually one of the challenges, right? So a lack of transparency. Hand in hand is the lack of what we call participatory decision making. So put a different way, I feel I don't have an impact on the outcome of the decision, right? So a lot of the time, what would be particularly helpful is for there to be consultation. Again, governments may do it, and in Singapore, we consult a lot, but sometimes people don't seem to understand the nature of consultation. People think that, if you consult me and then the government decides on an outcome that is contrary to what my view is, somehow there was no point to the consultation, and that's not fair. Right? Consultation is the fact that you take into account my views, but you may well make a different decision because there are a lot of other things you have to take into account, right? So there are these two twin, key parts. One is transparency. The second is participation, right? Now, I'll pause here for a moment. There may be other sort of things that we can talk about, but those, to me, I think are very key in affecting how people feel about governance and whether they trust it or not.
I guess if you apply some of those, could you also apply that to trust deficit between institutions, not just the government, between countries, between companies, between, the NGO and the people who work in a district? The same thing would apply, right? Transparency and
Absolutely. And so if I moved away a little bit from sort of the government context and I talk about between businesses, right, between companies, right, and this is kind of my wheelhouse, because when two companies have a dispute, it could be a legal dispute, it could be something that could be a personal dispute, it doesn't matter. Essentially, there is a trust deficit. The conflict itself lends itself to saying, I don't trust you, I don't trust what you're saying. And in fact, Adil, if you and I were in conflict, whatever you say to me, I'm going to immediately assume it's a lie. And vice versa, right? Because when people are fighting, typically we will attribute negative intentions to the other person, true or not, it doesn't matter,
Right.
Right. So part of the role of mediation, and for those of our friends who may not be entirely clear what that is, let me just quickly say what it is. It's basically the introduction of a third-party neutral to help facilitate a problem-solving process between two parties. So the mediator is not a judge, that mediator is not an arbitrator, and the difference between judges and arbitrators is that they actually deliver an outcome or an award, a judgment, whereas a mediator is basically there to assist. A mediator has no power to impose
To
a
force
decision.
anything, yeah.
Exactly
Right.
right. Exactly right. So what a mediator do, if you think about it that way, the mediator is pretty powerless, right? The mediator can't tell the parties you have to do this or you have to do that. But what essentially we're trying to do then is the mediator then needs to be able to figure out what is the basis of the trust deficit. And you can use the SCORE model, you can use a number of different models. And then how do we connect and address that trust deficit? So let me share a simplified way of thinking about, especially in commercial disputes, what the trust deficit might be as a result of, right? Number one is that they may not actually understand what each other wants, right? And I know that sounds silly because we're all adults, we should be able to communicate, but it's amazing sometimes how people talk at cross purposes, right? And when you're angry, when you're upset, when you're in a conflict, we don't tend to listen very well. And I think this is a common experience for many people, right? So one cause then is we don't understand one another. A second cause is actually, I understand perfectly what you want, but I'm actually not
But I'm not.
able to actually give you what you want, right? So it's a matter of ability. It's a matter of saying, maybe I don't know what the solution could be, right? The third aspect of a trust deficit is actually what we say the motivation. So I may understand what you want, I may be able to give you what you want, but I just don't want to, right?
Okay.
And a lot of the time that happens in a fight. A lot of the time that happens in a fight. And how you address each of those trust deficits or the causes of those trust deficits will be different. In mediation, we apply something that comes out of the Harvard Law School, Harvard Negotiation Project. It's called the 7-element framework. If any of our listeners would be interested in the Harvard framework, they should get a book called Getting to Yes. Getting to Yes was written by Professor Roger Fisher, William Ury, and Bill Patton. It was first published in the 80s, and to date is still the best-selling negotiation book ever. It's actually been translated in many different languages. Please don't worry, I don't get a kickback from this. This is not an advertisement. Just saying, just in case people were wondering. But essentially, I found it to be a very, very helpful book. It's not a textbook, by the way, so it's something you can actually read at night, before you sleep. It's actually very easy to read. It's a very readable book. But in that book, basically, Roger Fisher and his co-authors basically talk about what they call an interest-based model. An interest-based model basically means, or says, that Adil, if you and I have a dispute, and if you want something, but I can't give you what you want, and we only think about it at that level, obviously there can be no solution. We're fighting about limited matters, right? However, there might be a reason for why you want something. Okay, and if I'm able to discover why you want what you want, and we call the why what you want is interest, we may actually be able to find some overlap, right? So I'll share with you a childish story. It comes from the book, okay, and it's a bit of a childish story, but please bear with me. I'm a big child myself. There's a little boy and a little girl fighting over an orange. And if each of them wants the orange, essentially one must win and one must lose, right? There is zero sum, what we call win-lose. Now, if the mother, for example, cuts the orange in half, right? Then they get 50-50. We call that a compromise. But interest-based problem solving is about asking the little girl and the little boy why they want the orange,
Ah, okay.
right? And I think you already see the solution, right? If the little boy says, I want the orange because I'm thirsty, I want to drink the juice, which makes perfect sense. It's completely reasonable, right? And the little girl says, well, I actually want the rind of the cake, rind of the orange to make a cake, right? Immediately, in this very simplistic, admittedly, example, right, both parties could have 100% of what they want. Now, it doesn't always work like that in the real world. But win-win doesn't have to be 100%, 100%. Win-win can actually be 60-60. As long as the both sides get more than 100% added up, that's win-win, right? So it adopts what we refer to as a problem-solving approach. So if I immediately apply what I've just shared with you to our problem. So Adil, you want something, I can't give it to you. I ask you why you want it. I need to understand your interest. So if the trust deficit is as a result of a lack of understanding, I can ask you about your interests. I can ask you about how you see things. I can promote and facilitate understanding. Similarly, Adil, listen, I want to give you what you want, but in order for me to give you what you want, I need to get X, whatever X may be. So I too have the power to share with you to help you understand what is it I want.
Mm-hmm.
That's assuming understanding is the problem, right? That's assuming understanding is the problem. Now, let's say, for example, Adil, you and I both understand each other very clearly. We both understand our interests, but we can't figure out a solution, right? And so we don't have the ability to solve it. Now, the lack of ability comes in two ways. Number one, you might not have the authority. The second is you have the authority, but we just can't think of the outcome. We just can't think of something outside the box, right? Those are two very different problems. So if Adil, I'm dealing with you and you don't have the authority to say yes, I might have to actually say, Adil, who do I have to talk to? Right? Maybe that's the solution, maybe. But by and large, if we both have authority, then we need to think of a way to solve the problem. So, for example, in the Harvard framework, we have something called options. Options are possible solution sets that are created as a result of our mutual interest. So, for example, back to the orange, right? Because we understand what the two kids' interests are, the clear option that's on the table actually is to give the girl the rind and give the boy the juice, right? Thereby giving 100%, 100%. Okay. That's trying to think outside the box, trying to create something that actually may not have initially existed. Okay. If you and I were going to buy and sell, say, a car, right? And let's say you cannot immediately pay me for all of that, the cost of the car. And maybe in my case, I actually would like to sell the car because I need to buy a new one. But let's say the option is this. You buy my car on an installment basis, and we come to some kind of an agreement that I get to use the car one day of the weekend because that's when I need it. Right? So it no longer is just about a single issue and usually about money. It's more about how can we be creative about solving the problem, right? And that's to address the second cause of a trust deficit, what we will refer to as the ability. Motivation, which is the third one, and that's the trickiest one because sometimes people just want to be difficult. We all know that there's these personalities called the high conflict personalities, right? A lot has been written about them. I think the first truth that we need to face is simply this. You can bring a horse to water, you can drag a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. Okay, I think that is a saying that is familiar to many of us, right? And you can't force the horse to drink, just as you cannot force someone to be motivated to give you what you want, to say yes. The trick, however, is to understand what the levers are. So you can't bring a horse to water. You can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But you can feed the horse enough salt so that it is thirsty and will drink of its own self, own accord. Right? So in a negotiation, if my counterpart, if Adil, you are not motivated to help me, then one of the things I need to be able to say is well, hang on a moment, Adil, is this because what levers can I use? Is it because you think that you have a better alternative elsewhere? Is it because you actually don't realize that if we don't say yes today, you actually have a much larger problem coming your way, for example? Is it because you don't understand that by saying yes to me today, we can both benefit in ways that we cannot actually imagine? I mean, this is why companies make deals, right? And joint ventures, right? Making the pie bigger, right? So you will see in some of these very simple examples I've given you, and again, I apologize, they are very simple examples just for the discussion. It allows us to actually analyze the cause of a trust deficit within a mediation, within a dispute, and how to address each of those. Now, bringing in a mediator is an even more unusual situation. Why? Because the mediator can sometimes see the solution to a problem that the parties can't see. Right? So I believe this saying is attributed to Einstein. Einstein is purportedly says, now I say purportedly because with the internet you never know who really said anything, but on Einstein purportedly said, you cannot solve a problem with the same level of thinking that created that problem. Right? Now, even if you never say that, I think that makes sense, right? And so what a mediator does is the mediator comes in and takes what we call a third view, a third side, a third party perspective, and may well be able to catalyze some kind of agreement between the parties because he or she is actually a third party person that can give some kind of structural process or content input, right? And this is why mediation is so helpful in resolving commercial disputes. Okay, Adil, I'm going to shut up now because I feel
No,
again
no,
I've
no. This
spoken
is
too
very
much.
helpful. I was trying to just ask you, Professor Lee, if you, where do you see, for example, how does that apply when you are talking about two nations, trying to think about, and trying to bring them together on something? Because nations, while companies may have a fight that lasts, for a year or 6 months or whatever,
Sure,
nations
sure.
seem to have fights that last for decades.
For decades, sometimes centuries. It's it is in this is topical. And first, Adil, please call me Joel. Like, calling me Professor
Okay,
Lee just makes me
great.
feel very
Okay.
old. But that's tricky, right? At some level, at the international level between countries, it gets far more complex. And so let me just share some thoughts on that, and then share a caveat.
Sure. No, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So at the international level, I think, as you point out already, the operation of history is sometimes difficult, challenging, and causes it to be intractable. Right? Now, we don't just see this kind of intractability in international disputes. We sometimes see this in religious disputes as well.
Okay.
Right. So I believe in India, if I have my information correct, there was actually a sort of a religious related dispute that was resolved not too long ago, and it was through the intervention of a mediator. I'm not sure where the details of that, but I believe that was done as well. Right. So sometimes when you're dealing with historical matters, where people's emotions and religions and values run deeply, it is sometimes quite challenging. Right. So we see this now clearly in the Middle East. We see this now, I think, clearly in what is happening in Russia, in Russia and Ukraine. Right. And that kind of historical challenge makes it difficult because the question must surely be, how much in the past do we want to live?
Mm.
How much do we want to take a forward problem-solving approach, right? And so this is tricky because, for example, in situations where there have been crimes against humanity, for example, or when people have been tortured, tribunals have tried very hard to provide some, not just compensation, because that's not just it, but some kind of outlet, some kind of ability for people to come to closure on some of the atrocities. I think people realize, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. I believe that's attributed to Gandhi. But the general sense is that I need to come to terms with my past before I can move to the future, right? And expecting people not to address the past, perhaps not to solve every problem of the past, but to at least acknowledge the past before going to the future is sometimes a little bit unrealistic. And I think that's one of the challenges of nations sort of negotiating, resolving disputes, right? Now, the second challenge that makes it a little bit more complex is that nations sometimes have to perform to an international audience. Right. So it's no longer just, what's in our interest and what we want to do. How we look to the world is also an interest.
Yes.
It's also a very strong concern. And if I roll over and, just give in, right, what message am I sending to my neighbors? What message am I sending to other nations that will deal with us, right? So it's balancing the tension between being strong, what we would say, exercising our sovereignty, but also trying to solve a problem, trying to move forward, right? And that's why many nations decide to go to the rule of law, right? Singapore, for example, does a lot via the rule of law, via the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and so on and so forth, because it needs to be seen to have a very strong set of legitimate criteria moving forward, right? And if we don't go by the law, then our size becomes a disadvantage to us.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So nations have to also take that into account, and it gets a little bit tricky, right? Okay. It's also resource based. So I've already kind of mentioned a small country having a dispute with a larger country, right? The larger country generally has more resources, generally will be able to prolong it, right? There, you could say that the chest is much larger. The smaller country does not have those options, right? So sometimes, the smaller country has to take into account, how long can I keep this up, right? Now, we of course juxtapose this against the downside. Let's say we don't go to the rule of law. Let's say we don't go to the ICJ. Let's say we don't resolve this dispute by mediation or negotiation. Let's say we choose the final option, which is war, right? We declare war. And I'm very sad to feel like in this world, people seem to be far quicker to that than anything else, right? That's tricky too, because obviously the larger country can probably survive a prolonged altercation than a smaller country, right? It's just simply a matter of resources and size, right?
How do you? Sorry. Go ahead, please. Sure.
Yeah, no.
Go ahead.
So all this causes a certain amount of trickiness in resolving international disputes. Okay, it doesn't mean it can't be done. It means that we have to be sensitive to what we call sometimes the two tracks of negotiation, right? There is the track that is public and that is going to be played out, right? And it will take a long time, right? It's like the Camp David Accords, for example. Those took a very long time to do, right? And I think anyone would be very foolish to think that, my gosh, they met for a few days and they came out with a solution. I mean, negotiators and mediators were working furiously in the background for years, right? To get this right. And similarly, right? The conflict in the Middle East right now, arguably there was and sort of an agreement that worked for a period of time, it no longer works, right? Or at least for the presently for the parties. So I have no doubt that people are in the background working furiously, talking to parties on both sides, talking to people, governments, trying to broker a potential deal, right? Okay, it will get rolled out later, but we don't see it, so it feels like nothing is happening. Right. And sometimes Adil, the metaphor analogy I like to use is when you grow bamboo. I'm not sure you're familiar with how bamboo grows, but if you are, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You can plant bamboo, and for 5 years, it looks like nothing is happening. Right? You might think to yourself, the bamboo is dead. Right? But year number 6, it sprouts, and then its rate of growth over the next few years is very, very rapid. Right? But it needs 5 years for results to be visible. Right? The same, I believe, goes for international conflicts. There are peacemakers in the background working very hard. Right? And so that leads us to think about two things. Number one is there is hope. And number two is, as individuals and as institutions, as countries, what can we do to support that kind of peace work? What can we do to help build the capacity of countries to be able to resolve disputes in a way that doesn't mean we have to go to war? Right? Now, I said that I have a few thoughts on that. Those are my thoughts, but I have one caveat. And the caveat right now is that we are living in a very, very strange world. I don't know if you feel this, but from my perspective, it seems to me that the world is becoming more and more fractured. Typically, the countries that we look to for reason and rationale and common sense seem quite intent to move down a path that I'm very concerned and I don't understand. And I won't name the country or the countries involved, but it seems to me like it's time for, I suppose, other countries to step up and be the voice of reason, right? Because at the end of the day, typically who we look towards are basically navigating challenges of their own.
Right. Great. Joel, I wanted to come back to the trust deficit in a smaller way, right, between public officials and citizens, right?
Sure.
And what are some of the kinds of trust deficits that you have seen, and which ones are likely to be more amenable to mediation?
Okay, so if we were to take a look at some of the types of trust deficits that occur, for example, sometimes if a public official is too arrogant, it's too snobbish, it's too, and unfortunately it comes from, I think, something that's common between India and Singapore. We come from what we call a hierarchical sort of society, or a high power distance index is what we call it in cultural studies. And so people feel like, oh, I'm a politician, or I'm a minister, or I'm a professor, or whatever, that somehow we are better than people on the ground, for example. Right. And of course, we're really nice to them only when during elections, because, we need their vote. Okay. But otherwise, we act in a way that is a little bit disconnected. Right. And I think one of the key things is to be able to convince the populace, right, that actually the connection is continual, that I actually do understand. So that requires a lot of groundwork, a lot of ongoing grassroots work. Right, to keep in touch with the needs of the people. And I realize that's easier said than done. India is a very large place. I get that. Okay, but even if we make that a little bit of that effort, okay, it can actually lead to a slow reversal of the trust deficit. Right, you don't need mediation there. You just need to be a little bit mindful about how you interact with others. Right, but let's say that there is a dispute. Let's say a member of the public is unhappy about a decision that the government or government body or local government is doing, for example. Okay, typically they would complain, or they will begin proceedings in court, depending on how long they're prepared to wait. I understand that court proceedings can take sometimes decades to get to fruition, right? And so at the end of the day, how willing is that local government, that official, how have they demonstrated their willingness to actually come to some kind of resolution? Now, it may be that the resolution cannot be entirely what that person wants, but it may well be that that person can have a sense of being consulted, can have a sense of the transparency of the process, okay, and have it referred to, for example, a neutral evaluator, which might be an option, right? So you could actually have third-party neutrals, not exactly mediators, but third-party neutrals coming in to help facilitate the conversation, right? Because obviously there might be language problems, there might be access problems, there might be technology problems. And actually now in this age of technology, what I feel is that we rely on technology so much that we forget the fundamental people skills, we forget the human touch, right? I think you, sir, and I belong to a generation where technology was not that big a deal. We still believe in the human connection. But a lot of the younger people today would much rather write an email, send a text,
Then talk to anyone.
than talk to anyone, which is very strange. I think, right? And I think you, like me, of that same sort of background. So a little bit more of a human connection will help, because at the end of the day, I think that's why that's important. Let me give you a quick example. There's a very famous case study involving doctors. And doctors have this concept called the bedside manner, right? And so a doctor with a good bedside manner basically is very good with the patient and so on and so forth. And then there are doctors who are not good with their clients or with their patients, right? Now, the study was simply this. Patients were more inclined to want to sue a doctor with a bad bedside manner, and they were less inclined to sue a doctor who had a good bedside manner, even if the doctor that committed the mistake was the one with good bedside manner. Right?
Interesting.
Yeah. So and this is documented. This is not. I'm not making that up. Right. So basically, literally, they've said to patients, "Listen, you why do you want to sue that doctor? He didn't do anything wrong. It's the other guy." And the patient says, "But I like the other guy."
Right.
Right. Similarly, there's a very famous case study in business school, where they study, at least in the past, how Disneyland managed their disputes or managed some crises that happen on site. And essentially, their recovery protocol is so effective, right, that if somebody is injured or somebody has unhappiness or dissatisfaction, or there's been an incident, the team deploys and makes sure that that person's needs are looked after and addressed, right? And so any unhappiness doesn't actually happen. And so the rate, the amount of actually complaints or lawsuits against Disney actually drops quite significantly, simply because the way we manage it makes a difference. I think governments and corporations, especially big corporations, can take a leaf from these two types of case studies, right? One is obviously an institutional one is actually a personal one. But the human connection, I think, is key. And we are missing that. We are human beings after all. Okay, and I'm not a computer, even though I suppose our brains are very sophisticated computers. Right.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. And I also wanted to get your sense of how do you know right away that some conflicts are just not manageable? It doesn't matter how hard the mediator tries. Right at the beginning, you get a sense, and what gives you that sense?
Okay, I have to tell you that I try anyway, and the reason I try anyway is based on two things. So I don't know if you're aware, Adil, that 7 out of 10 disputes that go to mediation get settled.
Oh, is that right? Wow.
That's a very high hit rate, right? And this is an international number, right? It's not just Singapore or one particular country. on average around the world is about 70%. Some
Wow.
places boast 80, some places boast 60, but basically on average, right? But I can also tell you that 10 out of 10 disputes that go to mediation, the parties and their lawyers have already tried to resolve it, right? And despite the fact that they all go in believing it cannot be settled, 7 out of 10 settle. Which means that something happens within the mediation process that helps parties see things differently.
I see.
Right. So I'm not so quick to basically look at something and say, cannot be resolved. And it's actually very, very important that when I go into a mediation, I do not have in my mind the belief that it cannot be solved. And the reason for that is very straightforward. So you will be familiar with someone called Roger Bannister.
Yes.
Roger Bannister basically broke the 4-minute mile back in the day, in the 30s, I think, 1930s, I think. The thing is this: until Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, athletes did not believe it was possible. In other words, they believed that the 4-minute mile was not possible. All right, and they all tried it; they couldn't do it. Bannister came along and basically said, "Hold my beer, watch me." Okay, he didn't actually say that, but close enough. He basically says, "Watch me," and he did the 4-minute mile. Now, here's the funny thing: after Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, athlete after athlete started breaking the 4-minute mile. It's not as if magic occurred; it's as if they suddenly believed it was possible. Now, the reason I'm sharing this with you is simply this: if I, as a mediator, does not believe that there is at least a 70% chance that this could be resolved, it will leak out in my non-verbals. In other words,
I see. You'll telegraph it. Yeah.
I telegraph it. All right. I subconsciously communicate to parties and their counsel it cannot be done. And if they believe I believe they cannot be done, then they will not put in the effort. They will not have hope.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why we sometimes say a mediator must be a cheerleader. Right.
That's right.
And please do not imagine me in pom poms and cheerleading outfit, because that's a very bad image. But the fact that if we believe as much as we can that it is possible, there is actually, the odds are in your favor, 70% chance, right? And of course, if you've done your level best and there is no possible resolution, then at least you've done your level best.
Right.
But I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I don't want to assume it cannot be done because, as they say, you miss 100% of shots you don't take. Right. So
I wanted to ask
anyway.
you what are the characteristics of a good mediator? What does it take, given all of these constraints that you get into? What makes a good, what makes a good mediator? Is it someone who doesn't lose their cool, or someone who can handle all kinds of people? What is it? What do you need to be a good mediator?
I think the first thing is you need to have excellent people skills. If you cannot communicate and connect with the parties and their lawyers, they would have no reason to trust you. And if they don't trust you, they won't share information. And information is our lifeblood, right? We need the information to help understand the problem, right? So good people skills. Okay. Secondly, good analytical skills, right? And that's the ability to listen for, ask for interests, and try to see the bigger picture. Now, those two things are skill sets, okay? But in terms of characteristics, which is what you asked, I think a mediator needs to be very patient. Because obviously parties may not be done fighting and may still want to fight in front of you for a little while. So you must be patient. Secondly, you must be persistent. Right? And so you cannot let a no, or you cannot let some disappointment cause you to give up, right? You must be persistent. You must believe in it is what it is you're doing. The third thing is you must be a little bit like an optimist, right? That cheerleader.
Right.
Some people say
Right.
Pollyanna, be a little bit Pollyanna, but the idea is actually to basically say, you know, it, it's possible. Let's see what's possible. Let's just see what's be hopeful. I think, right now, I'm sure I could actually drill down and come up with a whole bunch of other characteristics, but I think those three are very, very important, are key, right? Because they help pull you through the difficult times.
And Joel, can you just talk about one, you talked about mediation between countries, between companies. When it comes to mediation between the government and a set of its citizens, right? So it's not an individual,
Yes.
right? It's a set of citizens. How does that change the dynamic and what are the things you have to look for in there?
Yeah. I think that you'd first need to define what your desired outcome
Mm,
of that interaction is, right? Because some disputes, some problems with the citizenry is not necessarily resolvable. There are some things,
mm,
for example, that a government cannot do or should not do because they are the government, right? So I think the question is what is your desired outcome? What are you trying to achieve, right? And then you design a process that helps get you to that point. So it may not
mm.
actually be mediation. It might
I
be
see.
a series of facilitated meetings, for example. It might be a series of consultations, right? It might actually be a third party neutral, but not a mediator coming in to represent groups of people, for example, right? The important thing here is actually what's your outcome, how do you design a process that gets you to that outcome?
I see.
Yeah. So
What do you
those
mean
are the two
about, can
things I
you
would
just
keep in mind.
describe what is the process? Like what do you mean by designing the process?
Okay. So are you going to design a one big meeting where everyone's there? Are you
Ah,
going to
okay.
break it up into smaller groups? How do you chunk it down?
Yep.
Are you going to have a series of meetings? Each meeting has a different purpose. For example, the first meeting might be to set some ground rules, might be to hear people out. The second meeting might be to then explore the problem. The third meeting, and so on and so forth. So sometimes you just have to define the process a little bit because it might not be done in 2 hours. If it's complex, it might take weeks. But sometimes it takes as long as it takes because in English we have a saying, you cannot help a tree to grow by pulling it. It sometimes needs to grow at its own pace. Okay, in Singapore, we use a slightly different saying. We say, you can't hurry good curry. Sometimes curry, you need to let
Right.
it stew
Takes
for a
time.
little
Yeah.
bit. Yeah, it takes time. Takes time.
And so that's why your patience comes in, right?
You have to be patient. And so I like to think I'm a very patient person. And if I get impatient, I don't let it show.
Right.
Yeah,
I
because
can, yeah.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
So because if you let it show, right, parties might get the wrong message. They may themselves get impatient. They may then lose hope.
So
You
mediators
know?
have to be good poker players.
One hopes. Yeah.
They
So
don't show
let's
any
not
emotion.
let's not play poker. Let's not play poker.
Can you talk a little bit about how, technologies are affecting everything? Whether it is AI or whether it is VCs or whatever. How has technology changed the nature of mediation or will
Um,
change?
well, I think it has changed. There are good and bad parts to technology. I think we all accept that. And technology can be your mobile phone. It can be the internet. It can be AI, as you point out. Can be platforms like what we're using, right? It can be things like Zoom, Google Meet, all of those. Um, Let me deal with some of the bad ones first. I think the bad ones is, the irony is that the internet was supposed to be the great leveler, right? It was supposed to ensure that
Right.
everybody had access to information. But here's the problem, right? People now use technology and there's fake news. It's very hard to tell the difference between real and false. Even if you're getting information, you might be getting very superficial information, right? And so anybody with access to a mobile phone may not get full information or have the faculties to be able to analyze what they're getting, or to have the skills to actually get detailed analysis, right? So that's some of the downsides. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of superficial information.
Mm-hmm.
So people, very trigger response, very, very short fuse, right? Okay. But having said that, I think technology is very powerful because it grants access and justice, for example. Access to justice is a very key thing, right? And if we accept that mediation is a way to access justice, right? The courts in Singapore, America, England, I think in India have also said this, right? Mediation is a different way to access justice. People can use technology where in the past they would have had to travel days to get to a mediation or to report on a matter. Okay, now you have Zoom, right? In fact, one of the plus points about COVID, I mean, COVID was a terrible time, but one of the silver linings to COVID was that everybody very quickly learned how to use online platforms to communicate.
That's right. That's right.
And that provides access, right? People can be reached relatively easily. So that's one advantage. The second advantage, of course, is there's a lot of information out there, right? Which is pro and con, but the pro is that people know what their rights are. People know what's possible. People know what mediation is. If I don't know what mediation is, I can just Google it, right? And if I Google it, I search for it, I can get relatively decent information.
Okay.
Right? Okay. Now, the third thing is the use of AI. And this is new, as you know, right? But I think it is still untapped. I, too, am only beginning to explore the use of AI. In the process of using it for various things like teaching, writing, mediating, and so on and so forth. So I don't feel I can speak very much about it, but I think that with AI, you have to be very, very careful about how you prompt it, right? So we sometimes we say garbage in, garbage out, right? If you ask a useless question, you get a useless response, and the key actually is to be able to prompt the AI to give you useful responses. Okay. The caution, of course, is that AI have what we call delusions or hallucinations.
Yes.
So you have to be very careful. You need to check your information because AI sometimes makes stuff up, and many people have gotten caught out. Okay.
Right.
So I won't pretend I know any more about AI than just that.
No, I was going to ask if in the future AI is going to start playing a mediation role because it is infinitely patient, right?
It is, but I don't think, I mean, there's a lot of talk about whether technology can take over some of our roles. I think a lot of the roles that humans do that are low value roles, okay, will get taken over by technology eventually. It's like basically making things, right? Manufacturing. In the old days, it was done by persons and by hand. Technology basically replaced all of that, right? Right. So, but that doesn't mean that we will become extinct. What it basically means is we need to move up the value chain. So I don't think technology, at least not at this point, can replace the human touch. I don't think it can replace, for example, the spark of creativity that politicians, ministers, mediators, counselors, teachers have. If we are content with doing low-level, sort of low-value roles, it's a matter of time. But higher-level roles, I think we still have a place. And so it's really a matter of saying who is the master and who is the servant, right? If we let AI be the master, then we only have ourselves to blame. But it can be a very, very good servant. Okay, we just need to know how to master ourselves and that tool very, very well. Adil, have you frozen? Oh, here we go.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's all right.
Yeah.
I think there was an internet outage for a little while.
Yes. No, I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
So Susan was just coming to tell me that I'd frozen, but don't worry. When we edit it, it'll be fine.
That's fine. You were looking so serious. I'm wondering whether you were thinking deeply about something.
I was I was thinking deeply about it. Joel, this has been very, very fascinating, and there are many, many different aspects we can go over. But just given the time, I think I would like to end with a last question, which is,
Sure.
in what areas have you seen mediation being most helpful in reducing the trust deficit?
My wheelhouse is actually commercial disputes, so I can really only speak to that. I've seen um, disputes between companies from different countries resolve very high value disputes. Trust was very low then, but the mediators were able to bring parties together and get them to see solutions where they did not realize existed. I've seen families positively affected by this,
Oh, is that right?
where
Interesting.
yeah, so where, for example, warring, well, I say warring, but fighting siblings, being able to be brought together, and it ending with hugs, right? So almost a reconciliation, not what we always go for, but certainly possible. I see mediation as having the opportunity to heal risks in society, right? Whether they be religious or status or economics,
Mm.
a class, for example. Again, all having to be sort of sensitively managed, right? But the more we're seeking healing and transformation, the longer it takes, the more care we need to have with design, right?
Okay.
With commercial disputes, we generally have a process. We generally follow that process, and it can be resolved fairly relatively quickly. But sometimes disputes that lead to wars and death and injuries or religious strife will take a bit more time, because what we're trying to promote is actually understanding and the ability to live and let live, right? Just as we have a right to be here, everybody else has as well. Okay, and we need to find some way in which we can coexist in a satisfactory sort of way.
Perfect. Joel, that's a great note to end on. I want to thank you very much for taking time and clarifying many aspects of mediation and giving us a very interesting framework, the SCORE framework, to try and think that through. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for your time and your help.
Thank you for having me and for your great questions and for putting up with my long-winded answers. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.